Hi, welcome back to my channel. If you're someone who's dealt with growing up in a toxic family, stay tuned because I am talking about 4 behavioral patterns that children develop when they've been raised in a toxic family and how that is still showing up in adult life and how you can manage through as an adult. So not too long ago, I had a client who came in with me and they were really having some struggles about their childhood experiences, the effects and the impact of their childhood. This person was well into their 60s and their childhood was something that was impacting them in their 60s. And that is not uncommon. And so that is why this conversation is so important, to understand the patterns that do show up and develop and get created in childhood and how they stick with you and can keep you from being able to experience true joy and freedom in your life. How these things can still be roadblocks is something that I want you to really think about in your own life if this is you. Before we get started, I would like for you to hit the like button and the subscribe button, and let's get started. So let's envision a family where there are 4 children and the family is dealing with domestic abuse. Let's let that be the theme of the toxicity. We're going to talk about how these 4 children may deal with the issues in their childhood and how that plays out into their adulthood. So the first child, let's say, is the oldest child, and the way that they deal with domestic abuse in their family is they try to protect. Let's just say that the father is the abuser, the mother is the victim. And this oldest child tries to protect the family. They try to protect his mother, her mother, and they get involved in the disputes often to try to break things up. So this person takes on the role of being a protector, being responsible for protecting and for providing some kind of safety when it's not being offered by one of the parents. And the way that this can develop and continue to develop is it can be a lot of pressure on a person in their childhood. And one way that this particular person dealt with it in their adulthood is they started to disconnect from their family in adulthood. Like, they would have connection with their family, but they also did a lot of work outside the family to keep from having to be connected. So they got involved in work and causes that meant a lot to them. Where they also needed to be responsible, to lead, to be able to show up and be more of I'm not gonna say savior, but be someone who helped to rectify a lot of problems that they were experiencing or that were being experienced in community. And so this person spent so much of their time in that, it caused them to be able to avoid a lot of family gatherings, because that was where dysfunction was still rearing its head, and it was something that they hadn't dealt with. They knew how to lead, they knew how to protect in certain ways, but it was very difficult to do that in their own family structure. So the first example of a child and how they deal with these types of toxicities is to be a protector. And the way that that can play out in adulthood is that that person can take on roles of responsibility so much that it can be exhausting. And it can also be to the point and for the purpose of avoiding the pain that they experienced in their past. And I would really say that one of the ways to really start addressing this in all of these is going to be awareness. But in addition to that is being able to give your time to sit still, to be still, to not always be caught up in the business of your work and your mission, because what that ultimately does is causes exhaustion. And then if these are things that you truly do have a passion for, you end up not being able to fulfill them because burnout is a real thing. So let's move on to the second oldest child. The second oldest child is the middle child. And in much literature, it talks about how a middle child tends to be a peacemaker. They tend to try not to get involved in the chaos. They try to bring harmony. And so this next child, when the family would have these disputes, when the domestic violence would start. Oftentimes, while other children in the home were maybe trying to break up the chaos, or maybe they were calling the police to stop the chaos, this particular child would leave the home. They would leave because it was too much for them to deal with, yet they never talked about it in that way directly to say there was too much to deal with. But the way that they managed in those moments was to leave and to escape in the moment. And as that played out in this particular person's adult life, is they really did get involved more in substances. And it's not necessarily to say that the domestic abuse was the direct link to the substance use, but what I will say is that in many homes, when there's toxic family patterns and conversations around these toxic patterns aren't safely able to be addressed, that a lot of communication gets sacrificed. A lot of conversations don't get had. And so the day-to-day experiences that this child could be having in life, their stresses, the influences in their social settings, they're not things that they would feel welcome to talk about with this dysfunctional family, right? There was a lot of volatility there. And so they could really feel like it just wasn't a place to talk. And so this is so important to a child when they have stress, to be able to come to family, this community of family, and what should be a support system, to be able to talk about your stressors, to talk about the influences around you. But in this case, this child, they escaped through the substance use. So they ended up dealing with their stressors instead of talking about them and dealing with them. They escaped into these habits of substance use, which is so common for many people when they've dealt with traumatic experiences or extreme adverse experiences. It can really be an escape for many people, not intentionally trying to get addicted to substances, but this is what happens to many people who've dealt with trauma. They are really trying to numb the pain and have a way to cope with something that's very difficult for them. So that's the second pattern that can be developed. And addiction can happen in many ways. It could be substances like, illegal drugs. It could be alcohol. It could be food. All of these could be ways that people really consume themselves to be able to have some form of control or some form of peace or escape that causes them to just be able to deal with what's going on in the moment. So the third child in this family structure is also a middle child, also somebody who wants to keep the peace, also somebody who wants to, have harmony in the home. And when the dynamics would happen in the home, they literally were this person who was trying to keep peace, loving both parents, wanting to see good for both parents, not wanting to pick sides with the parents. And they ended up being someone who was always there trying to keep some level of harmony amongst the family structure. And this family these parents ended up divorcing, which was very difficult for this child and the other middle child. It was very difficult for them to deal with. And this particular child ended up taking these patterns into adulthood, where it was always trying to keep harmony, always trying to keep peace, always trying to satisfy everyone, which causes a person to be a people pleaser. And taking those behaviors into their adult relationships caused them to take on a lot of responsibility, a lot of pressure, a lot of overwhelm, because to keep the peace, they wouldn't speak for their own needs. And it caused exhaustion for them. And it's something to really recognize, if this is you or if you relate to this, that boundaries are so important. Boundaries for yourself, to even say to yourself, what is really okay for me? Am I accepting something that in my heart I know is just not okay for me? Am I trying to appease someone so much on their end that it's not allowing them to take responsibility for what they need to in their life? So that people pleaser, to set boundaries. It can help you. It definitely helps you, but it can also help that person that you're trying to keep peace with to grow in the ways that they need to grow as well. It's not your responsibility to help them grow, but just by keeping your own boundaries, people have to deal with themselves, deal with their own things, and you not take on all of that burden. And the last child in this family structure, the baby, the youngest child, they took on a role of also, like the oldest sibling, being very protective, jumping into these fights, trying to stop the fights, trying to speak up to the dysfunction that was going on. And the way that this played out with them is that they definitely did stand up and have like an aggressive way of dealing with things, but they took those types of behaviors into their adult life as well, because they kept this guard up, and that aggression could come out in their relationships, especially intimate relationships. If they felt like somebody was disrespecting them or hurting them or trying to hurt them, then they would definitely use that same approach of anger or rage or high defense to really keep control in their environment. Because what they experienced in their childhood was a lack of control. They were vulnerable. They couldn't control what their parents were doing. So in their adult life, to be able to have control was something that became sacred. It was safety. It meant that chaos couldn't come out of whatever was going on in those moments. And this can really be a blockage in relationships, because if you're very guarded or, respond with a lot of defensiveness, it can just make it difficult for other people to feel that they can truly communicate with you, truly speak their truth or their concerns, or deal with matters that really do need to be dealt with. And the fact of the matter is, in all of these situations, these are 4 children who grew up in the same home. If you're somebody who has grown up in a home where there has been some dysfunction, some toxicity, just know that even though all of the people, especially the children who grew up in the house, grew up in the same home, their view on what happened and how things were could be very different. The way that they perceived it could be very different. It could be very challenging, but in different ways for different people. And one person's experience is not going to be the exact same way that the other sibling sees the experience. And I think sometimes siblings can really get into a lot of strife and discord over this, because one particular sibling could see the situation one way and the other person could see it another way. But just know that in these situations, they're all children who were dealing with something that they didn't have control over, and it's the people were processing the situation the best way that they knew how at that young age. And so more than trying to convince a sibling to see the situation the way that you've seen it, or if you have a sibling who's trying to get you to see a situation the way they saw, what's more important is to let it be known that everyone had an experience, and try to understand the way that that person processed that experience in a space of dysfunction, and leave space for them to have had that way of seeing things. Because again, everyone is different, and just because everyone grew up in the same home doesn't make that the situation is going to be seen the same. Everyone has a different brain, different personality traits, and also different individual experiences that they could have had, different relationships with the parents who may have been toxic, or the structure that was toxic. The relationships could have been different, and more than likely were different for each individual in the home. So it's about healing, and part of that is leaving space for other people's experience to have been theirs, but for you to be able to speak on what was true for you in those experiences, and let that be the start of some form of healing amongst family. But that is what I want to leave with you today. Let me know in the comments if you relate to that, if you feel like one of those 4 examples of dealing with toxicity would be the way that you've dealt with toxicity or dealt with adversities. Leave it in the comments, and I will talk to you next week on my next video. Take care. Bye.